Willamette High Desert Margin, Oregon, October 1907. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of sagebrush and the promise of a killing frost. On a windswept parcel of dry land that angled toward the Columbia Plateau, a man was building something that made no sense. His name was Pyotr Yermolayev, a recent arrival, a Russian with a quiet face and hands that moved with an economy born of long practice. He was not building a cabin of pine logs, nor a sod house dug into the earth. He was lashing together a skeleton of 22 peeled lodgepole pines into a perfect 16-foot cone. Wendell Tatum, the Wasco County land assessor, reined in his horse on the ridge overlooking Yermolayev's claim. Beside him, Silas Croft, a man who had built half the barns in the county, squinted down at the strange structure. "What in God's name is that?" Croft asked, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "Looks like something the Paiute might have left behind 100 years ago." Tatum made a note on his clipboard. He calls it a Yaranga. The word felt foreign and flimsy on his tongue. Some kind of Siberian hide tent. Says it'll be warmer than a log house. Croft let out a short, sharp laugh. "Warmer?" "Wendell, that thing has more gaps than a goat's grin. A November wind will tear it to ribbons. The man's a fool. His wife and children will freeze before Christmas." Tatum's concern was less for the man's foolishness and more for the letter of the law. He had visited the property a week earlier, trying to explain the terms of the Homestead Act. A patent required improvement, a permanent dwelling of value. "It's not the wind I'm worried about, Silas. It's the paperwork. A hide tent has no improvement value. It's legally equivalent to pitching a canvas wall tent. When the federal inspector comes in the spring, he'll deny the patent. This Russian is building his family right off their own land." He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and bureaucratic frustration. The man's gone half mad from the journey. Down below, Pyotr heard the distant laughter on the wind, but did not look up. He took a length of cured sinew, soaked it in water to make it pliable, and began to lash another cross brace into place, his movements precise and unhurried. The mockery lasted for a day. The validation would take a winter. What did this quiet Russian, a man who managed a fur post at the edge of the world, understand about nested thermal chambers that a county assessor and a master carpenter had missed? This story is about more than just an unusual house. It's a lesson in humility, in the quiet genius of ancient solutions, and in the unyielding laws of thermodynamics. Stick with us, and I promise you will learn not just about the ingenious Chukchi Yaranga, but about the fundamental physics of creating warmth where none should exist. It's a principle that can transform how you think about shelter, energy, and survival. Before we go on, if you find value in stories of forgotten ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. It helps us bring more of these histories to light. And tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution to a common problem you've ever witnessed? Pyotr Yermolayev was not a carpenter. He had never felled a tree with the intention of building a wall, never mortised a joint, never chinked a log. He was not a farmer either. The stony soil of his Oregon claim was as alien to him as the moon. For 14 years, he had been a prikazchik, the manager of a remote fur trading post for the Russian-American company in the Chukotka Peninsula, a finger of frozen land pointing across the Bering Strait at Alaska. His world had been one of sable pelts, graded by the shimmer of their guard hairs, of walrus ivory weighed on brass scales, of barrels of seal oil whose scent permeated the very wood of the buildings, and of the guttural, patient language of the Chukchi hunters who moved through that landscape as if they were part of it. He was an old believer, a follower of a dissident sect of Russian Orthodoxy, and when the Tsar's government intensified its persecutions, he knew his time there was done. With his wife Agafia and their two small children, Lev and Sonya, he had fled, not west toward Moscow, but east across the strait into America. They traveled south, seeking a place where the land was open and the government distant, a place to build a life of quiet faith. They found their 160 acres in the Oregon high desert, a place whose winters, the locals assured them, were mild compared to the Midwest. Their first winter, in 1906, proved that assurance to be a catastrophic lie. They spent it in a hastily constructed pine cabin, a structure that followed the local customs to the letter. It was a miserable, drafty box that consumed firewood at an astonishing rate while delivering little in the way of comfort. That winter was a litany of small, brutal lessons in how cold attacks the artifacts of a warmer world. One morning, the steel bicycle pump Pyotr had carefully brought from the coast, a modern marvel, cracked clean across its footpad with a sound like a pistol shot when he stepped on it. The pine cones stacked in the woodpile, tight and dense, would snap open like paper fans when a particularly brutal wave of cold descended from the plateau. The most terrifying moment came for Agafia. Rushing inside from the well, her hands damp, she had grabbed the solid brass doorknob. The metal, super-cooled by the night, was a thermal leech. It froze the skin of her palm in a half-second, a searing, invisible burn. Her scream was sharp, with shock and pain. Pyotr had to pry her hand away, leaving a perfect, white outline of her skin on the knob. For the rest of that winter, they tied a leather thong around the handle. The memory of that frozen brass, more than anything, drove Pyotr's actions the following autumn. He would not spend another winter at war with his own house. He would build something the cold understood. The failure of that first cabin was not a failure of materials or effort, but of concept. It was a textbook example of why conventional frontier building methods were so punishingly inefficient. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the physics of the envelope around it. A standard log wall, even with careful chinking, possesses an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of perhaps R4, R5 at the most. Through every tiny gap in the mud and moss chinking, cold air infiltrated and hot air escaped. But the greatest thief of heat was the wind. A 20-mile-per-hour wind sweeping across the face of a wall can strip heat away with terrifying speed through the process of convection, making an outside temperature of 10 degrees feel like 20 degrees to the structure itself. Inside, the family lived by the tyranny of the fireplace. A massive stone hearth is a romantic image, but it is a deeply inefficient heating engine. It consumes enormous amounts of fuel, a cord of wood every week or two, to create a zone of radiant heat in its immediate vicinity. 10 feet away, the temperature could be 30 degrees colder. Water buckets against the far wall would freeze solid overnight. The Finch family, on the neighboring claim, spent their evenings stuffing old rags and newspapers into the gaps around their window frames, a nightly ritual against the invading cold. Marcus Finch complained that he could see his breath from his own pillow. This constant battle created a house of extremes. You were either sweating by the fire or shivering in a corner. The immense draft created by the chimney, pulling hot air up and out, also pulled cold air in from every crack and crevice, ensuring a constant, chilling circulation. The families were burning entire forests not to stay warm, but to stay slightly less cold. Pyotr watched his neighbors, saw his own suffering mirrored in their faces, and understood the fundamental flaw. They were trying to solve the problem with more fire. The real solution was to build a better container. The construction of the Yaranga began in late September. Pyotr selected 22 lodgepole pines from a stand near the creek, peeling them clean and letting them cure in the dry autumn air. He used no nails, no modern joinery. He laid the poles out on the ground and began lashing them together at their apex with sinew, forming the conical frame. As he and Agafia raised the 16-foot structure, it became a landmark of curiosity. Wendell Tatum made his second official visit, this time with Jebediah Stone, the owner of the general store in Dufour, a man whose opinion carried weight. Stone watched Pyotr anchoring the base of the poles with heavy rocks. "Yermolayev," he said, his voice not unkind, "you're a hard worker, I'll give you that. But this won't do. A man needs a solid roof over his head, timber and shingles. This is for summer camping." Tatum stepped forward, his clipboard a symbol of his authority. He was not a malicious man, but he was a man of rules. "Mr. Yermolayev," I tried to explain, "the land office requires a permanent dwelling for the patent, a structure with assessed value, a house, a barn, a fenced field. This," he gestured at the pine skeleton, "is legally a temporary native structure. It has an assessed improvement value of 0. I cannot in good conscience submit this as proof of homesteading. You are building your family out of a home. Do you understand me?" Pyotr paused, holding a coil of rawhide line. He looked at Tatum, his gaze calm and direct. "This will be warm," he said. It was not an argument, but a statement of fact. He turned and went back to his work. Agafia, watching from the door of their miserable cabin, felt a knot of anxiety. She approached her husband later, as he was stitching together the heavy cured deer and elk hides that would form the outer skin. "Pyotr," she said quietly in Russian, "the assessor is an important man. If he denies the patent—" Pyotr laid a calloused hand over hers. "Agafia, did we have a patent in Chukotka? We had warmth. We had life. First, we will have warmth. The paper will follow." His confidence was a comfort, but she still watched the graying autumn sky with a sense of dread. The final, most crucial part of the construction happened inside the conical frame. Pyotr built a second, smaller structure within the first. It was a rectangular box, roughly 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 5 feet high, a room within a room. The frame was light, made of willow branches. But its skin was the most precious material they owned, something they had carried with them all the way from Siberia. Rolls of cured, de-haired sealskin stitched together with waterproof sinew thread. He created 2 complete layers of it, stretched over the frame with a 4-inch air gap between them. This was the polog, the heart of the Yaranga. It was a soft, insulated, nearly airtight sleeping chamber. The entrance was a simple hide flap. Inside there was nothing but a low wooden platform for sleeping bags and a small stone dish for a seal oil lamp. To his American neighbors, he had built a tent inside a tent. To Pyotr, he had built a life raft for the coming winter. The genius of the Chukchi Yaranga lies in its elegant separation of problems. It solves the 2 greatest challenges of a cold climate, wind and heat loss, with 2 distinct specialized systems. It is a perfect example of nested chamber engineering, a principle that modern science would take another century to formalize. First, consider the outer cone. Its single most important job is to defeat the wind. Wind, or forced convection, is the great accelerator of heat loss. An object in still air at 20 degrees F loses heat at a certain rate. That same object in 20 degrees F air moving at 30 miles per hour will lose heat 3 to 4 times faster. The outer hide covering of the Yaranga, while not a great insulator, is an exceptional windbreak. It creates a pocket of perfectly still air inside the cone. The effective temperature on the walls of the inner chamber is therefore the still air temperature, not the wind chill temperature. This single function instantly reduces the thermal load on the inner chamber by an enormous amount. The space between the outer cone and the inner box becomes a sheltered, unheated utility area, a place to store firewood, tools, and food, all protected from the wind and snow. It is a thermal buffer zone, an architectural airlock. Now consider the inner chamber, the polog. This is the system designed to solve the second problem, heat retention. Its brilliance is in its combination of high insulation materials and minimal volume. The double layer of sealskin, with its trapped pocket of air, creates an insulating envelope with an R value of approximately R12. This is 3 times more effective than the solid log walls of his neighbors' cabins. More importantly, this highly insulated envelope surrounds a tiny, contained space. The interior volume of the polog was only about 240 cubic feet. A typical 15x15-foot frontier cabin has a volume of over 2,000 cubic feet. This is where the final piece of the puzzle fits, the heat source. Pyotr used a small, simple lamp fueled by seal oil, a fuel so energy-dense it was the lifeblood of the Arctic. The flame from this lamp, barely larger than a candle's, produced a steady, reliable output of approximately 600 BTUs per hour. For comparison, a single 100-watt incandescent light bulb puts out about 340 BTUs. The roaring fire in Silas Croft's stone fireplace might generate 50,000 BTUs, but 90% of that energy went straight up the chimney. Pyotr's tiny 600 BTU flame was releasing its heat into a super-insulated box a tenth the size of his neighbor's room. The heat had almost nowhere to go. It was a system of radical efficiency, not brute force. It wasn't about generating massive heat. It was about holding on to the little heat you had with absolute tenacity. That year, the winter did not creep in. It fell from the sky like an axe. In the second week of December, a vast mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex, slid down from British Columbia and settled over the Pacific Northwest. An Arctic outflow event began. For 8 consecutive days, the temperature on Pyotr's claim never rose above 30 degrees, and at night it plunged to 41 degrees. A relentless, dry wind blew from the east, a scythe coming off the Columbia Plateau. The very air seemed to crystallize. In the valleys, the needles on the grand firs, frozen brittle, began to snap and fall, covering the snow in a green carpet. The sound carried for miles in the dense, cold air, a faint, continuous crackling, as if the forest itself were breaking. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The Finch family's well pump froze solid on the second day. They resorted to melting snow over the fire, a task that consumed yet more precious firewood. Silas Croft, the carpenter, found his prize rooster, a magnificent Rhode Island red, frozen solid on its perch inside the henhouse. Inside his own well-built home, every nailhead on the interior walls was white with a perfect circle of frost, conducting the killing cold directly through the wood. Families lived in a small circle around their ravenous fireplaces, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Leaving that circle was a physical shock. At the Yermolayev claim, the wind howled and screamed around the conical Yaranga, but the structure, with its low profile and circular base, gave the gale no flat surface to purchase. The wind flowed over and around it like water around a stone. Inside the outer layer, the air was cold, but absolutely still. Pyotr could work on his tools there, sheltered and calm. But the true miracle was inside the polog. Pyotr would lift the sealskin flap and enter a different world. A wave of soft, dry, even warmth would greet him. The air was silent. The only light came from the small, steady flame of the seal oil lamp. Agafia would be on the sleeping platform, mending a shirt, her fingers nimble and warm. Lev and Sonya, their children, slept soundly under a single fur blanket, their faces placid, their breathing deep and untroubled. The temperature inside the tiny chamber held at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. On a small shelf Pyotr had built, a glass jar of kvass, a traditional fermented rye bread drink, sat undisturbed. A faint film of condensation beaded on its side, but the dark liquid within was alive, a few bubbles rising slowly to the surface. It was not frozen. It was not even cold. Every crock of stewed apple ferment in the valley had split open from the cold by the 1st of January, the frozen slush expanding and shattering the pottery. Pyotr's kvass, in its impossible pocket of warmth, continued its slow, patient work. On the 5th night of the Arctic outflow, the storm reached its zenith. The wind was a physical presence, scouring the snow from the ridges and piling it into deep, treacherous bowls. Wendell Tatum and his young deputy, a man named Miller, were out on horseback, checking on the isolated claims in the high country. It was a necessary but dangerous duty. The cold was so profound it felt like a malevolent intelligence seeking any weakness. As dusk fell, turning the snow-covered landscape a deep, menacing blue, their luck ran out. Miller's horse, struggling through a deep drift in a wind-scoured draw, stepped onto a hidden shelf of ice. Its legs snapped with a sickening crack. The animal screamed, a sound instantly swallowed by the wind. They were 10 miles from the nearest town, 5 from the closest cabin they knew. Miller was already showing signs of frostbite, his face a waxy white. Tatum knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they would be dead in 2 hours. Their heavy coats were no match for this level of cold without shelter. Then Tatum saw it. On the next ridge, barely visible against the blowing snow, was a faint conical silhouette. The Russians' place, the foolish hide tent. It was their only chance. Leaving the horse, they began to stagger toward it, leaning into a wind that felt like a solid wall. It felt like an hour later when they stumbled up to the Yaranga. Ice caked Tatum's beard and eyebrows. His glasses were opaque, with a thick layer of white frost. He beat a numb hand against the stiff outer hide. A moment later, a figure emerged. It was Pyotr, his face calm. He took in the scene with a single glance, 2 men on the edge of collapse, and simply gestured for them to come inside. They pushed through the flap into the outer chamber. The immediate cessation of the wind was a physical relief so profound it almost buckled Tatum's knees. The air was frigid, but it was still. They were out of the enemy's teeth. Pyotr said nothing, but pointed toward another, smaller flap set into the box-like structure in the center. He lifted it for them. Tatum ducked through, expecting the worst. He expected a wave of smoky, animal-smelling air, a marginal warmth that was more psychological than physical. He expected to see a family huddled in a single pile of furs around a dying, inadequate fire. The reality was a complete sensory dislocation. A wave of clean, dry, silent warmth washed over him. It wasn't the scorching, localized heat of a fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He fumbled with his frozen gloves to pull off his glasses. His face felt the warmth first, a tingling sensation as blood returned to the frozen skin. Before he could wipe the lenses, an impossible thing happened. The fog on them, the thick white frost from his own breath, began to shrink from the edges, clearing in a slow, perfect circle. In 90 seconds, he was looking through clear glass at a small boy sleeping peacefully in his shift, his cheek flushed with warmth. A woman, Agafia, looked up from her sewing and gave him a small, compassionate nod. The deputy, Miller, crawled in behind him, muttering in disbelief. It's like summer in here." Tatum stood there, speechless. He, a man of numbers and assessments, of board feet and property values, was standing in a hide tent at 41 degrees below zero, and he was warm. He was truly, deeply warm. He looked at the tiny, flickering flame of the oil lamp, no bigger than his thumb, and then at the vast, frozen wilderness outside. It did not compute. He took a breath, and the air didn't hurt his lungs. He had not just been proven wrong. His entire understanding of the world had been fractured. In that moment, he saw Pyotr not as a foolish immigrant, but as a man who possessed a form of knowledge so profound it bordered on magic. You didn't build a strong wall, he thought. The line that would later crystallize in his mind was taking form. You built a quiet room. Wendell Tatum never offered a formal apology. Men like him rarely did. But his actions over the following months spoke louder than any words. In his next report to the land office, he listed Pyotr Yermolayev's dwelling not as a temporary native structure, but as an experimental insulated dwelling of a double-wall construction. He assigned it a provisional improvement value of $50, more than enough to satisfy the requirements for the patent. The Yermolayevs would keep their land. But Tatum did more than that. He was a practical man, and what he had experienced was a practical miracle. He went to see the Wasco County Extension agent, a forward-thinking man named Elias Thorne, whose job was to disseminate useful knowledge to farmers and homesteaders. Thorne, intrigued by Tatum's breathless account, rode out to the Yermolayev claim himself on a clear, cold day in January. Pyotr, with his usual quiet dignity, showed him the entire system, the wind-breaking cone, the still air buffer zone, and the warm, insulated heart of the prologue. Thorne, who had a degree in agricultural engineering, understood the principles immediately. He took out a notepad and sketched the two-chamber design, taking careful measurements. In the agency's January 1908 bulletin, nestled between articles on winter wheat and cattle feed, was a small piece titled A Principle of Nested Shelter. It described, with Thorne's precise drawings, a Russian immigrant's ingenious method for creating a warm space with minimal fuel. The article didn't gain wide traction with the established timber-minded homesteaders, but it was read with intense interest by 3 Russian Molokhan families who had settled further down the valley. They, like Pyotr, were religious refugees who understood the brutal logic of a Siberian winter. By the next autumn, 3 new conical structures, variations on Pyotr's design, stood on the high desert margin, ready for the cold. The idea was beginning to spread. Pyotr Yermolayev, with hide, sinew, and knowledge carried across an ocean, had built a perfect house within a house. It was a principle modern building science would rediscover a century later with concepts like superinsulation, air tightness, and heat recovery ventilation. The most advanced passive houses of the 21st century are, in essence, highly technical Yarangas. They separate the wind-breaking layer from the insulated layer and use a tiny, efficient heat source to warm a tightly sealed interior. The Chukchi people, and the observant Russian who learned from them, knew this not from theory or computer models, but from thousands of winters of direct feedback from the coldest classroom on Earth. His neighbors, men of timber and iron, built fortresses. They put up thick walls and burned whole forests to fight the winter, a battle they waged every hour, every day. Their homes were loud with the constant hungry roar of the fire and the shriek of the wind in the eaves. They lived in a state of perpetual conflict with the world outside their door. Pyotr had learned a different way in the far north. He knew you could not defeat the infinite cold of a winter night. The attempt was arrogance, a recipe for exhaustion and misery. You could only step aside and let it pass. He applied that lesson in Oregon, on a patch of land that everyone else saw as a battlefield. He didn't build one wall against the cold. He built a quiet room inside a noisy one, and let his family live in the quiet. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of ancient wisdom in building or survival have you encountered? Your engagement helps us continue to unearth these forgotten histories. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.